Hi, in this edition of Coffee Break Conservation, we're going to look at a failed retrofit project in a cellar which directly led to dry rot, an outbreak of dry rot behind the plasterboard wall lining. The cellar had been previously tanked, and the moisture which I'm going to show you is not through a failure of the tanking system or other water ingress into the cellar, as we might sometimes see. This is directly related to condensation behind the plasterboard wall lining, which allowed for dry rot to occur. So this is the area. This is before we started the exposure, and what you're looking at here is an internal cellar wall which has been previously tanked, as I just said, and then it has a system of battens with glass fibre insulation in between it, plasterboard on the top, and then an MDF skirting, as you see there. Here we see a fungal growth, which was the first observation that the homeowner made, just peeking out from underneath the skirting. And just to the side of this, we can see blistered paintwork and that characteristic curve shape in the MDF, which is very commonly seen when MDF gets damp and then starts to swell. So in this particular case, the homeowner had used social media such as her Facebook channels and YouTube to work out how to insulate her cellar to make it a habitable room, and then contacted a local building firm to undertake the work. It was done approximately 5 to 6 years before this exposure, and I understand that there was no professional advisors, surveyors, architects, or other retrofit specialists involved in this. And this is something which we all need to be mindful of, that many of these retrofit schemes have not had any professional input. So the moisture content in the MDF skirting is, as we see here, exactly in the right range for dry rot to occur in a concealed dark environment. So the process of exposure started initially by taking off that area of the skirting board where the first observations were made. And here we can see the first signs of the dry rot fungus together with the wet thermal insulation and the timber stud. And here we see some moisture on my gloves, and this is perfectly sufficient for dry rot to occur. So there's no actual leak or flooding occurring. It is simply an accumulation of condensation. So the process of exposure continued, first of all, sideways by removing the remainder of the skirting, and then we went up and removed whole panels of the plasterboard, and the dry rot was seen to extend vertically up to the ceiling, and indeed it went into the room above, the two rooms above the cellar, into the floor, skirtings and so forth, and that will require additional exposure later. So this gives you a very good idea of how the dry rot had spread both vertically and then trying to grow sideways. Quite mature, as I say. It's probably about 5 years old at its oldest point, and here we see some very mature fungal growths here, and this is exactly as the textbook image that you may have seen elsewhere. So it's grown on the timber stud work. It expanded into other parts of the floor and adjacent brickwork, growing sideways onto floor joists as we see here, and the remediation is going to be quite extensive once it's all been fully exposed. Here is a section which had been removed, and we get a very good view here of the very mature dry rot. So lessons learned here are that the cellar had been insulated and then plasterboarded over, which would reduce the internal wall temperature of the cellar walls, which in turn led to the condensation and provided the conditions for the dry rot. It was entirely avoidable, and unfortunately now the homeowner has a quite expensive task on hand to deal with this and get the building back into a good state of repair. So there we go, yet another failed dry rot retrofit project.